He thought humiliating her would prove his authority, but he had no idea he was about to dismantle his own career in front of the very people who gave him power. The boardroom of Coleman Industries stretched wide and immaculate, 40 feet of polished marble reflecting the sharp lines of navy suits and the quiet arrogance of those who believed they controlled everything within those glass walls. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with noise, but inside, only one voice mattered. Richard Coleman stood at the head of the 12-seat table, his silver cufflinks catching the overhead lights as he spoke with practiced dominance, outlining a billion-dollar expansion strategy with the confidence of a man who had never been challenged in his own domain. Every eye was on him, every nod measured, every silence deliberate. This was his stage. This was his kingdom. And then, barely noticeable at first, came the soft, rhythmic sound of a mop gliding across marble. Angela Brooks moved along the far edge of the room, her presence so quiet it almost dissolved into the background, a woman in her late 30s dressed in a simple gray maintenance uniform, her movements efficient, her gaze lowered just enough to avoid drawing attention. She had been in that building for years, long enough to learn how to exist without being seen, how to move through rooms filled with power without disturbing it. Or so they thought. Richard paused mid-sentence, his eyes flicking toward the sound, irritation tightening his expression for just a fraction of a second. The interruption was small, insignificant, but to a man like him, control wasn't measured in size, it was measured in perfection. And imperfection, no matter how minor, demanded correction. "Is this really happening right now?" he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the nearest executives to hear. A few exchanged faint smirks. Angela didn't stop. Didn't react. She simply continued her slow, deliberate path across the floor, as if the room, and the man commanding it, didn't exist. That, more than anything, caught Richard's attention. He straightened slightly, adjusting his jacket as he turned fully toward her, the room following his gaze. Like a ripple effect. "Excuse me," he said, louder now, his tone slicing clean through the air, "this is a private executive meeting." The words hung there, sharp and deliberate. Angela stopped. Not abruptly, not nervously, just a quiet halt, as if she had always intended to pause at that exact moment. The room stilled with her. She turned her head just slightly, enough for her voice to carry without raising it. "I understand," she said calmly. No apology. No rush. Just acknowledgement. Richard let out a short, humorless laugh, glancing briefly at the board as if inviting them into the moment. "Then you also understand that people in your position don't belong in rooms like this." A few chuckles slipped out, polite, restrained, but present. The kind of laughter that reinforced hierarchy without ever needing to say it out loud. Angela's grip on the mop loosened just slightly. Her shoulders straightened. And for the first time, she looked directly at him. Her eyes were steady. Unbothered. Almost, knowing. Something in that look caused one of the board members, a man who had been silent the entire meeting, to shift in his seat, his brow tightening just a fraction. Richard didn't notice. He was too focused on the reaction he expected, the one that always came next: embarrassment, retreat, submission. "Security is down the hall," he added, gesturing casually toward the glass doors, his voice laced with finality. "You can finish, whatever it is you're doing somewhere else." Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. Not the controlled kind. This one lingered, stretching just a second too long. Angela didn't move. Didn't lower her gaze. Instead, she took one small step forward, the sound of her shoe against marble echoing far louder than it should have. And in that moment, something shifted. Subtle. Almost invisible. But real. Because across the table, the same board member who had shifted earlier was now staring at her, really staring, as if trying to reconcile two completely different realities colliding in the same space. Angela's voice came next, calm as ever, but this time, there was something else beneath it. Precision. "That's interesting," she said. And the room went completely silent. Richard's smile lingered for a fraction too long, the kind of smile that expected submission, expected silence, expected the natural order of things to reassert itself, but Angela did not lower her eyes and she did not step back, and that was the first crack, small but undeniable, spreading quietly across the room. The air shifted, subtle at first, like a change in pressure before a storm, and somewhere along the table a pen stopped moving. Interesting. Richard repeated, his voice tightening slightly, the amusement fading into irritation as he tried to regain control of a moment that was no longer entirely his. Yes, Angela said, her tone calm, measured, almost thoughtful, as if she were observing something rather than reacting to it. How quickly assumptions are made in a room that is supposed to value information. A few heads turned. Not toward Richard this time, but toward her. That alone should have told him something was wrong. But power, when held too long, has a way of dulling awareness. This is not a discussion, Richard replied, his voice sharper now, stepping closer, reclaiming space the way he always had. This is a workplace, and there are protocols. You are interrupting a meeting that impacts millions of dollars. Angela's expression did not change. If anything, it softened, just slightly, in a way that did not match the tension building around her. Then accuracy should matter even more, she said. Silence followed. Not polite silence. Not passive silence. This one carried weight. Across the table, the same board member who had been watching her leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as recognition flickered into something more certain. His tablet lit up under his hand, fingers moving quickly, pulling up information that should have been routine but now felt urgent. Another director noticed. Then another. The quiet tapping of screens began to replace the earlier laughter. Richard noticed the shift, finally, but misread it completely. He mistook it for discomfort, for impatience, for the need to end this distraction quickly. I am going to ask you one last time, he said, his voice controlled but edged with authority that had never been questioned. Leave the room. Angela looked at him fully now, not as an employee looks at an executive, but as an equal studies a decision already made. You are asking the wrong person to leave, she said. The words landed with precision, clean and undeniable, and the room reacted before Richard could. A chair creaked. Someone inhaled sharply. The board member at the end of the table slowly stood, his tablet still in hand, eyes locked on Angela as if confirming what he already knew. Richard, he said, his voice no longer neutral, no longer aligned, you might want to reconsider. That was the moment. The exact second when control slipped, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. Richard turned toward him, confusion breaking through his composure for the first time. Reconsider what? He asked, the question sharper than intended. The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned the tablet outward, just enough for the others to see, and one by one, expressions changed. Confidence faded. Certainty collapsed. Understanding took its place. Angela did not move. She did not need to. Because the room had already begun to move for her. The tablet did not make a sound, but the silence it created was louder than anything Richard had said all morning. Numbers, names, ownership structures, voting rights percentages, all laid out in clean, undeniable lines across the screen, and as it passed from one board member to another, the shift became visible, not just in their expressions but in their posture, in the way they leaned back from Richard and toward the truth unfolding in front of them. Angela stood exactly where she had been, one hand resting lightly on the handle of the mop, her presence no longer blending into the background but anchoring the entire room. Richard glanced from face to face, searching for reassurance, for alignment, for anything that resembled the control he had held just moments ago, but what he found instead was distance. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice rising just enough to betray the crack forming beneath it. No one answered immediately. The man who had first stood kept his eyes on Angela, then spoke with careful clarity. "This is the updated ownership report that was circulated last night." Richard frowned, irritation returning as a defense mechanism. And why am I just now seeing it? A pause. A long one. Because, the man continued, his voice steady, you dismissed the pre-meeting briefing. A few eyes dropped. Not in guilt, but in quiet acknowledgement of a pattern they had all seen before and chosen to ignore. Richard reached for the tablet, his movements quicker now, less controlled, and as he scanned the screen, the color in his face shifted, not dramatically, not instantly, but enough. 51%. Voting control. Primary investor. The name sat there in plain text, undeniable and unmovable. Angela Brooks. The room held its breath. Richard looked up slowly, the confidence that had defined him replaced by something unfamiliar, something closer to disbelief. That is not possible, he said, but the words lacked force, lacked conviction. Angela tilted her head slightly, not in challenge, but in quiet observation. It has been possible for quite some time, she replied. No emphasis. No pride. Just fact. One of the directors cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as if the act could restore some sense of normalcy. The acquisition was structured through a series of private holdings over the past 3 years. Another added, more cautiously, all compliant. All disclosed. You signed off on the final integration last quarter. Richard's mind raced backward, flipping through decisions, approvals, documents he had treated as routine, as beneath his attention, and each realization landed heavier than the last. He had not been misled. He had simply not looked closely enough. And now, standing in front of the woman he had just dismissed, that oversight was no longer a minor detail. It was everything. Angela took a single step forward, the soft echo of her shoe against marble drawing every eye back to her. You spoke about control, she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, about understanding the room. Richard said nothing. He could not. Because for the first time since he had entered that boardroom, he did not understand the room at all. Around the table, the directors exchanged glances, silent but decisive, the kind of communication that did not require words. Alignment had shifted. Authority had moved. And in that quiet, undeniable transfer of power, one truth settled over the room with absolute clarity. The position Richard held had never truly been his. He had only been allowed to occupy it. And now, that permission was gone. No one spoke, because in that moment, silence was no longer empty, it was judgment, and it pressed against Richard Coleman from every direction like walls closing in without ever moving. He stood there, tablet still in his hand, staring at the name that had just dismantled everything he thought he controlled, and for the first time in years, he did not have a response ready. Not a strategy. Not a correction. Not even a deflection. Around the table, the board members who had once mirrored his confidence now avoided his eyes, not out of fear, but out of recalibration, as if they were already adjusting to a new reality where he was no longer at the center of it. Angela Brooks remained composed, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence no longer questioned but undeniable, and the contrast between them was no longer about clothing or position, it was about awareness. This is a misunderstanding, Richard finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, reaching for something familiar, something he could still control, but the words landed weak, unconvincing even to himself. One of the senior directors leaned back slowly, folding his hands on the table, his tone measured, deliberate, there is no misunderstanding. Another nodded, glancing again at the tablet before looking directly at Angela, everything is documented. Every transfer. Every acquisition. Every vote. The clarity in his voice removed any remaining doubt. Richard swallowed, the shift in power now complete but still settling in his mind like a delayed realization. He turned back to Angela, searching her expression for anger, for satisfaction, for anything that would explain why she had stood there in silence while he spoke to her the way he did, but he found none of it. Just calm. Just control. You should have said something, he muttered, the sentence barely forming before it left his mouth, as if he needed her to carry part of the responsibility for what had just happened. Angela's eyes held his, steady and unyielding, but not harsh. You did not ask, she replied. The simplicity of the answer cut deeper than any accusation could have. A quiet shift moved through the room again, subtle but final, as one of the board members reached forward and pressed a button on the conference phone, canceling the remainder of the presentation without discussion. Another closed his folder. A third adjusted his seat, no longer angled toward Richard, but toward Angela. These were small movements, almost insignificant on their own, but together, they marked the end of something that had once felt permanent. Richard noticed every one of them. He had built his career on reading rooms, on sensing momentum, on staying ahead of shifts before they became visible, but now he was experiencing it from the other side, watching alignment move away from him in real time, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Angela took another small step forward, not to dominate the space, but to occupy it fully, her voice calm, measured, and precise. Leadership is not proven by who you can dismiss, she said, her words carrying clearly without force, it is revealed by who you choose to see. No one interrupted. No one challenged her. Because at that point, there was nothing left to challenge. The truth had already settled into the room, and it was not going anywhere. Richard lowered the tablet slowly, his grip loosening as the weight of it became unnecessary, and for a moment, he looked around the table one last time, hoping to find something familiar, something that still belonged to him, but all he found was distance. And in that quiet, irreversible shift, the role he once commanded no longer existed the way he remembered it, because the room had already chosen someone else to follow. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, carefully, deliberately, like a decision being formed without needing a vote, and in that quiet transformation, the authority that once belonged to Richard Coleman dissolved into something smaller, something uncertain. He remained standing, but the stance no longer carried weight, no longer commanded attention, and for a man who had built his entire identity on control, that loss was not loud, it was hollow. Angela Brooks did not raise her voice, did not claim the room, did not demand recognition, because she did not need to. The room had already recognized her. One of the directors cleared his throat, the sound unusually loud against the stillness. We need to address leadership alignment, he said, choosing his words carefully, but the meaning was unmistakable. Another nodded, leaning forward with a seriousness that had not been present earlier, effective immediately. The phrase landed like a quiet verdict. Richard's eyes flicked toward him, then to the others, searching again, still hoping for resistance, for hesitation, for anything that suggested this moment could be slowed, but what he found instead was consensus. Not rushed. Not emotional. Just clear. A decision that had already been made in the space between silence and realization. You cannot be serious, Richard said, his voice lower now, controlled but strained, as if holding on to the last threads of authority by force of habit alone. No one reacted to the tone. That, more than anything, confirmed it. The man who had first stood earlier stepped forward slightly, his posture no longer aligned with Richard but with the table as a whole, with the company itself. This is not personal, he said, though everyone in the room understood that it was precisely about judgment, about decisions, about the ability to see beyond surface and assumption. Angela remained still, her presence anchoring the moment without dominating it, her eyes moving briefly across the table, not to command, but to observe, to understand the shift that had just occurred not only for Richard, but for everyone present. This company was built on insight, she said quietly, her voice steady, reaching every corner of the room without effort, not on appearances. The words settled into the air, not as criticism, but as clarity. One director closed his folder fully this time, the soft click, echoing more final than any raised voice could have been. Another straightened his posture, turning slightly toward Angela, not formally, not ceremonially, but instinctively, as if recognizing where direction would now come from. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension leaving him in a way that felt less like relief and more like surrender, not forced, not dramatic, just inevitable. He looked at Angela again, but this time, there was no expectation in his gaze, no assumption, only a quiet realization that the moment he had tried to control had revealed far more than he intended. Angela adjusted her grip on the mop, a simple, grounded movement that contrasted sharply with the magnitude of what had just taken place, and without any announcement, without any declaration, she turned slightly toward the door. Not as an exit. Not as a retreat. But as a reminder. Because even in that moment of complete reversal, she chose restraint over display, dignity over dominance. And as she took her first step away from the table, the room remained silent, not out of uncertainty this time, but out of respect, the kind that is not given freely, but earned in a single moment when everything is revealed for what it truly is. The door did not close behind her, but somehow the room felt sealed, as if the moment itself had locked everyone in place, forcing them to sit with what had just unfolded. Angela Brooks walked slowly across the marble floor, the soft rhythm of each step echoing with a quiet certainty that no longer needed validation, and as she reached the edge of the room, she paused, not for effect, not for attention, but because something unfinished lingered in the air. Behind her, no one resumed their seats. No one returned to their notes. The meeting that had once been meticulously planned now existed in fragments, scattered between realization and consequence. Richard Coleman remained where he stood, but the posture that once defined him had dissolved into something unfamiliar, something smaller, and for a man who had measured his worth in authority, the absence of it was louder than any accusation. He looked toward the board again, slower this time, as if hoping that time itself might reverse what had just happened, but the faces he saw were no longer aligned with him. They were no longer waiting for his direction. They were waiting for something else. Or someone else. One of the directors shifted his chair, turning fully toward Angela, even though she was no longer at the center of the table, and that simple movement carried more weight than any formal announcement could have. "We should continue," he said, his voice measured, but the direction of his gaze made it clear what he meant. Another nodded, yes, but with the correct perspective. The words were careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. Angela turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge them, her expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if this moment, as significant as it was to everyone else, had always been inevitable to her. She stepped back toward the table, not reclaiming space, but accepting what had already been given, and as she did, the room adjusted again, chairs aligning, attention focusing, not out of obligation, but recognition. Richard noticed it all. Every glance. Every shift. Every quiet realignment that no longer included him. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped, the instinct to lead colliding with the realization that there was nothing left to lead. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was decisive. Angela placed the mop gently against the wall, a simple gesture that carried a quiet finality, and for the first time since she had entered the room, her hands were free, not as a symbol, but as a fact. "The numbers you were reviewing," she said, her voice steady, returning to the very topic that had been interrupted, "they are not incorrect, but they are incomplete." The shift was immediate. Attention sharpened. Not forced. Not rehearsed. Natural. Because authority had already moved. A director leaned forward, interest replacing uncertainty. "What are we missing?" Angela met his gaze without hesitation. "Context," she replied, the word landing with precision, and context changes everything. Across the table, a few heads nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in understanding. Richard lowered his eyes briefly. The weight of the moment settling fully now, not as a sudden fall, but as a gradual acceptance that the room no longer belonged to him. Angela stepped closer to the screen, her movements unhurried, her presence steady, and as she reached for the presentation remote that Richard had set down minutes earlier, no one questioned it. No one hesitated. Because the decision had already been made long before anyone put it into words. And in that quiet transition, the difference between position and power became undeniable, because one can be given, but the other is revealed only when everything else falls away. Angela did not rush, and that alone shifted the energy in the room even further, because power that needs to hurry is often uncertain, but power that moves with patience knows it already belongs. She stood near the screen, the remote resting lightly in her hand, her eyes scanning the faces around the table not to measure approval, but to understand readiness, and what she saw was no longer resistance, but attention sharpened by realization. The display behind her still held Richard's final slide, bold projections, confident forecasts, numbers that once carried authority simply because he presented them, but now, stripped of context, they felt incomplete, almost fragile. Angela pressed a single button, and the screen shifted, the slide changing not dramatically, but precisely, revealing layers beneath what had been shown before, additional data points, timelines, structural dependencies that reframed everything. A quiet murmur moved through the room, not loud enough to interrupt, but enough to signal that something deeper was being revealed. "Your projections assume linear growth," Angela said, her voice steady, not correcting, not criticizing, just stating what was already visible, but the market does not move in straight lines. One of the directors leaned forward, his earlier uncertainty replaced with focused curiosity. "Are you suggesting volatility beyond the current models?" Angela nodded slightly, not suggesting. Demonstrating. She clicked again, and a new chart appeared, subtle but undeniable, showing patterns that had been overlooked, risks that had been minimized, opportunities hidden behind assumptions. The room grew quieter, but this silence was different from before. This one carried engagement, understanding, respect. Richard remained standing off to the side, his hands no longer anchored to anything, his presence now disconnected from the flow of the room, and as he watched Angela move through the data with calm precision, he recognized something he had dismissed earlier, something he had not even considered worth noticing. She was not reacting to the moment. She was leading it. "If you follow this trajectory," Angela continued, her tone measured, each word placed with intention, "the expansion succeeds for 12 months, maybe 18, before the structure begins to strain." She paused just long enough for the weight of that timeline to settle, then added, "And by the time the strain becomes visible, it will already be too late to adjust without significant loss." A director glanced quickly at the numbers, then back at her. "What is your alternative?" The question came naturally, without hesitation, without formality, as if it had always been her role to answer it. Angela shifted her gaze toward him, not claiming authority, but accepting responsibility. "We adjust the foundation before we extend the structure," she said, the simplicity of the statement carrying more clarity than any complex explanation. "We slow the visible growth to stabilize the underlying system." Another director nodded, almost immediately, "That reduces short-term gains." Angela met his observation without hesitation, "It protects long-term stability." The distinction landed clearly, and across the table, subtle nods began to align, not out of agreement alone, but out of recognition of a perspective that had been missing. Richard exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, but in that breath was the full weight of realization, because everything she was saying, everything she was revealing, had been available, had been accessible, had been present all along, and he had overlooked it. Not because it was hidden, but because he had chosen not to see. Angela stepped back slightly from the screen, allowing the information to settle. Giving the room space to absorb what had been presented, and in that moment, no one looked to Richard for confirmation, no one waited for his approval, because the direction had already shifted, and the room, once centered around him, had quietly and completely realigned around her. No one interrupted her, and that was the clearest signal of all, because in rooms like this, silence was never accidental, it was earned. Angela stood beside the screen, not dominating the space, but defining it, her presence steady, her voice measured, and as the data remained displayed behind her, the board no longer saw projections, they saw consequences. One director adjusted his glasses, studying the chart again with a level of attention that had been missing earlier. "If this pattern holds," he said slowly, "we are not just facing instability, we are accelerating toward it." Angela nodded once, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement of understanding. "Yes," she replied, "an acceleration without control is not growth, it is exposure." The distinction settled heavily across the table. Another director leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. Why was this not addressed in the original proposal? The question hung in the air, but it was not directed at Angela. It did not need to be. The absence of an answer spoke louder than any explanation. Richard remained still, his silence now no longer strategic, but unavoidable, because every path he could take led back to the same realization. He had seen the numbers, but he had not understood them. Angela pressed the remote again, and a new layer appeared, this time revealing a timeline of internal decisions, approvals, and structural shifts, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. "These are the points where adjustment was possible," she said, her tone calm, almost reflective, but each time, the decision favored speed over stability. A director exhaled quietly, the weight of that statement landing not just as information, but as accountability. Another leaned forward, his voice more direct now, "And your recommendation corrects this?" Angela did not rush to answer. She allowed the room a moment to fully process the question before responding. "It does not correct the past," she said, "but it prevents the future from repeating it." The clarity of that distinction shifted something deeper in the room, because it was no longer about defending decisions, it was about redefining them. Across the table, subtle nods aligned again, not forced, not coordinated, but natural, the kind that happens when understanding replaces assumption. Richard finally moved, just slightly, a small shift of weight, a quiet adjustment that signaled something had changed internally as well, but it was too late for that change to influence anything now. The room had already moved forward. Angela stepped away from the screen, allowing the data to remain visible, not as evidence against anyone, but as context for everyone, and in that moment, her restraint became as powerful as her insight. She was not there to prove someone wrong. She was there to make the company right. One of the senior directors folded his hands, looking directly at her now, not with curiosity, but with certainty. "What do you need from us to implement this?" The question carried weight, not just because of what it asked, but because of what it assumed. Leadership had already shifted. Angela met his gaze, steady and composed. "Alignment," she said simply, "and the willingness to prioritize what is not immediately visible." The room absorbed that, quietly, completely, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was no hesitation in what came next. Because the decision was no longer about who was in charge. It was about who understood what truly mattered. The word alignment did not echo, but it settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, because it was not a suggestion, it was a requirement, and everyone at that table understood the difference. For years, decisions had been driven by momentum, by confidence, by the assumption that speed equaled success, but now, standing in that same room, surrounded by the evidence of what had been overlooked, the board was facing something far more demanding than growth. They were facing responsibility. One of the directors leaned forward, his fingers interlocked, his voice steady but more deliberate than before. "If we move forward with this adjustment, we will need to restructure timelines across every division." Another nodded, already thinking ahead, and recalibrate investor expectations. The conversation was no longer theoretical. It had shifted into execution. Angela listened without interruption, her expression composed, her attention precise, absorbing not just the words, but the intent behind them, and what she saw was not resistance, but readiness. That was the difference. Earlier, the room had been focused on defending a plan. Now, it was focused on building the right one. "Then we begin with transparency," Angela said, her voice calm but firm, guiding the direction without forcing it, not as a reaction, but as a standard. A director across the table raised a thoughtful concern: that level of disclosure may create short-term uncertainty. Angela met his gaze without hesitation. "Uncertainty is not created by truth," she replied, "it is revealed by it." The clarity of that statement shifted something deeper, because it removed the fear from the equation and replaced it with accountability. Around the table, subtle nods followed, not as agreement alone, but as acceptance of a new standard that could no longer be ignored. Richard remained still, his presence now almost separate from the conversation, not excluded, but no longer central, and as he listened to the discussion move forward without him, he began to understand something that had never been obvious before. Authority could command attention, but it could not create trust. That had to be earned. Angela stepped slightly closer to the table, not to take control, but to remain connected to the flow of the conversation, her movements measured, intentional, reflecting the same balance she had shown from the beginning. "We also reassess internal review protocols," she continued, her tone steady, each word placed with precision, not to slow decision-making, but to strengthen it. A director who had remained quiet until now finally spoke, his voice thoughtful, that would require a cultural shift. Angela nodded once. Yes, she said, and culture is the foundation every structure depends on, whether it is visible or not. The statement lingered, because it reframed everything that had been discussed, moving the focus from numbers and projections to something deeper, something that could not be measured as easily, but determined everything that followed. Across the table, attention remained fixed, not because it was expected, but because it was earned, and in that sustained focus, the shift that had begun earlier reached its full form. This was no longer a room reacting to a mistake. It was a room redefining its direction. Richard lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when understanding arrives too late to change the outcome, but just in time to reveal the truth. Angela allowed the conversation to continue, stepping back just enough to give space for others to engage, not withdrawing, but trusting the process she had just set in motion, and as the discussion evolved around her, one thing became unmistakably clear. Leadership had not been taken. It had been revealed, and once revealed, it could not be unseen. The discussion no longer needed prompting, it moved on its own now, guided not by hierarchy but by clarity, and that shift was unmistakable to everyone in the room. What had once been a structured presentation had transformed into something far more deliberate, a recalibration happening in real time, and at the center of it stood Angela, not directing every word, but shaping the direction of every decision. One of the directors tapped lightly on the table, drawing measured attention. If we are realigning timelines and recalibrating projections, we will need a unified message before the next earnings call. Another followed immediately, and we cannot afford inconsistency across departments, not after what we have just uncovered. The urgency was there, but it was no longer driven by pressure, it was driven by awareness. Angela listened, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and when she spoke, the room adjusted without being asked. Consistency begins with understanding, she said, her tone calm but precise, and understanding cannot exist without transparency at every level. The words did not challenge anyone, yet they left no room for shortcuts. A director near the far end of the table nodded slowly, then we restructure communication channels first. Angela inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the direction, yes, and we remove the barriers that prevent information from reaching the people who need to act on it. The simplicity of her approach carried more weight than any complex strategy, because it addressed the root rather than the surface. Richard remained silent, his presence now defined not by authority but by observation, and as he watched the room move forward without hesitation, he began to see the pattern he had once controlled now forming independently of him. It was not rebellion. It was correction. One of the senior directors leaned forward, his voice thoughtful but firm. We will need to formalize this shift immediately, both internally and externally. Another added, and leadership structure must reflect that shift. The statement lingered, heavier than the others, because it moved beyond strategy into consequence. No one rushed to respond, but no one resisted either. Angela met their gaze, not as someone claiming a position, but as someone who understood the responsibility behind it. Structure should follow function, she said, her voice even, grounded in principle rather than ambition, not the other way around. The distinction settled deeply, reframing not just the decision ahead, but the philosophy behind it. Around the table, the alignment that had been forming reached a quiet consensus, not through agreement alone, but through shared recognition of what needed to change. Richard exhaled slowly, the realization now complete, because every word spoken, every decision forming, confirmed what had already happened. The role he once defined was no longer shaped by him. It had moved on. Angela stepped back slightly, allowing the room to absorb the direction without dominating it, her restraint reinforcing the very leadership the board had begun to recognize. Then we proceed, one of the directors said finally, his tone clear, his decision aligned with the others, with immediate effect. Heads nodded, not hesitantly, but decisively, and in that moment, the shift that began with a single interruption had transformed into something far more significant. It was no longer about correcting a mistake. It was about redefining the foundation of everything that would follow. And as the room settled into this new clarity, one truth remained undeniable. The strongest authority is not the one that speaks the loudest, but the one that sees what others choose to ignore, and acts on it before it is too late. The decision did not arrive with a gavel or a raised voice, it settled into the room through quiet agreement, through the absence of objection, through the unmistakable alignment of people who had finally seen what mattered, and in that stillness, the next step became inevitable. One of the senior directors straightened his posture, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of the moment without needing to elevate it. We will need to formalize this transition. The word transition lingered, precise and deliberate, because everyone understood what it implied without it needing to be stated directly. Another director nodded, glancing briefly at Angela before speaking. Effective leadership requires clarity, and clarity requires accountability. The phrasing was careful, but the meaning was unmistakable. Richard remained where he stood, his presence now quiet, his earlier confidence replaced by something far more reflective, as if he were watching his own role being redefined in real time. Angela did not interrupt, did not rush to respond, because she understood that this moment was not about her stepping forward, it was about the room stepping into alignment. We should proceed with an interim structure, one director suggested, his tone measured, already thinking in terms of stability, until the full transition is complete. Another added, and we need to communicate that structure clearly to every division before the end of the day. The urgency had returned, but it was different now, grounded in purpose rather than pressure. Angela stepped slightly closer to the table, not to take control, but to remain engaged, her voice calm, steady, carrying the same clarity that had guided the room this far. Structure should reflect responsibility, she said, not just title. The statement settled deeply, reinforcing the direction already forming. A director near the center of the table turned fully toward her, his expression no longer questioning, but certain. Then you will need to be directly involved in overseeing this transition. The room did not react with surprise. It did not need to. The conclusion had been building from the moment she spoke. Angela held his gaze for a brief moment, her expression composed, thoughtful, not resisting, but not seeking it either. I will ensure the process remains aligned, she replied, her tone grounded in responsibility rather than authority. That was all it took. No declaration. No title. Just commitment. Around the table, heads nodded, not as a formality, but as recognition of what had already been decided. Richard exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but significant, as if releasing the last remnants of control he had once held, and in that breath was not just loss, but understanding. He looked toward Angela again, but this time, there was no expectation, no assumption, only a quiet acknowledgement of the difference between being in charge and being capable. Angela turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room, not to command, but to connect, and what she saw was no longer a divided table, but a unified direction. The shift was complete. Not because it had been forced, but because it had been revealed. And in that quiet, undeniable transition, the room did not need to be told who to follow. It already knew. The room did not erupt in applause, nor did it need to, because what had just taken place was not performance, it was transformation, and transformation rarely announces itself with noise, it settles in quietly, reshaping everything without asking permission. The board members remained seated, but their posture had changed, their attention no longer scattered or divided, but aligned with a clarity that had been missing before, and at the center of that clarity stood Angela Brooks, not elevated by title, but by understanding. One of the directors reached for his notes again, not out of habit this time, but with renewed intention. We will need immediate coordination across legal, finance, and operations, he said, his tone focused, already moving beyond discussion into execution. Another responded without hesitation, I will contact the department heads within the hour. The pace of the room had shifted, but it was no longer rushed, it was deliberate, every action grounded in the same principle Angela had introduced, stability before expansion, truth before projection. Angela listened, her expression calm, her presence steady, and when she spoke, the room adjusted once more, not because it was required, but because it was natural. Ensure the messaging reflects the reality, she said, her voice even, carrying the same precision that had guided every step of the conversation, not the expectation. A director nodded, understanding immediately, we present what is, not what we hope. Angela inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the alignment, and in that small exchange, the shift from assumption to accountability became complete. Richard stood quietly at the edge of the room, no longer resisting, no longer searching for control, but observing with a level of awareness that had not been present before, and in that observation, something deeper settled in, not regret, not frustration, but recognition. He had not lost the room in a single moment. He had never truly held it in the way he believed. The difference had only just been revealed. Angela turned slightly, her gaze moving across the table one final time, not to confirm authority, but to ensure understanding, and what she saw was no longer uncertainty, but readiness. Then we proceed with discipline, she said, her tone steady, each word carrying weight without force, and we measure success by what endures, not what appears. The statement lingered, not as instruction, but as principle, and one by one, the directors nodded, not out of obligation, but out of agreement with something that had become undeniable. A senior member leaned back slightly, exhaling as if releasing the last trace of tension, this is the correction we needed. Another added quietly, and the leadership we overlooked. The words were not directed at anyone, but they reached everyone. Angela did not respond to them. She did not need to. Because the moment no longer required validation. It had already defined itself. She stepped away from the table, not withdrawing, but allowing the room to carry forward what had been established, her movements as measured as they had been from the beginning, grounded, intentional, unhurried. The mop still rested against the wall where she had placed it earlier, a simple object, unchanged, yet now carrying a quiet symbolism that no one in the room could ignore. And as Angela reached for it, not as a return to where she started, but as a reminder of how she had arrived, the room remained silent, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect, the kind that cannot be demanded, only earned, and once earned, it changes everything. Angela lifted the mop with the same calm precision she had carried into the room, her hands steady, her movements unhurried, and for a brief moment, the contrast between where she stood now and how she had been seen just minutes earlier hung in the air like a quiet revelation no one could ignore. The boardroom remained still, not frozen, but reflective, as if every person inside it was recalibrating not just their decisions, but their perception of what had just unfolded. No one rushed to speak. No one attempted to fill the silence. Because for the first time, silence was not a gap in conversation, it was understanding taking shape. Angela turned slightly toward the door, not to leave in haste, not to escape the moment, but to move forward from it, and as she did, one of the directors stood instinctively, not out of obligation, but out of respect, a gesture so natural it did not require acknowledgement. Another followed, then another, until the entire room had risen, not in ceremony, but in recognition. Richard remained where he was for a second longer, his gaze fixed on Angela, not with confusion anymore, not even with disbelief, but with a clarity that had come too late to change anything, yet just in time to reveal everything. He had spent years believing that. Authority came from position, from visibility, from control over the room, but standing there now, watching the room shift without force, without demand, he understood something far more enduring. Authority that needs to be asserted is temporary. Authority that is recognized is permanent. Angela paused near the door, her hand resting lightly on the handle, and for a brief moment, she turned back, not to reclaim attention, not to reinforce what had already been established, but to leave something behind that did not need repetition. Her eyes moved across the room, steady, composed, meeting each gaze without hesitation, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same quiet certainty that had reshaped everything from the moment she first responded. The way you treat someone when you believe they cannot affect